The case began the morning Daniel Mercer called emergency services to report his wife, Claire Mercer, unresponsive at the bottom of their staircase, and from that first statement the record shows a marriage that appeared stable, affectionate, and financially ordinary until it was quietly altered by a decision few people knew about. A life insurance policy purchased 18 months earlier that named Daniel as sole beneficiary, a detail that would not matter for weeks because the death was initially ruled accidental, a fall, a misstep, a tragic moment inside a private home. The kind of conclusion that allows friends and family to grieve without suspicion, and before anything else unfolds, viewers are invited to pause, comment where they are watching from, and subscribe, because this story will travel through paperwork, testimony, and memory, and it begins with the version everyone accepted. Daniel said he woke to a sound, found Claire lying still, tried to revive her, and called for help, and responding authorities documented no forced entry, no visible struggle, and no immediate evidence of foul play. A checklist that closes cases quickly when grief is fresh and explanations feel sufficient. Claire was 34, a marketing consultant who worked remotely, organized household finances, and was known for meticulous planning. The sort of person who kept calendars current and notes precise, a reputation that would later clash with the idea of a careless fall. Daniel, 37, worked in logistics, traveled occasionally, and described their marriage as happy, supportive, and future-focused, a description echoed by neighbors and colleagues who saw routine, not conflict. The insurance policy had been purchased during a period when they discussed long-term security. According to Daniel, prompted by conversations about starting a family and protecting each other, a reasonable motive that fit the surface narrative. The policy was substantial, large enough to pay off the mortgage and provide comfort, not extravagance, and because it existed quietly among other documents, it did not surface during the early days when death certificates are signed and conclusions are made. The medical examiner listed blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, time of death estimated during early morning hours, and no toxicology flags that demanded further review. A report that traveled through offices and became the foundation of acceptance. Friends organized meals, family members flew in, condolences filled messages, and Daniel spoke publicly about loss with composure that some interpreted as strength and others would later reconsider. Within days he returned to work briefly, explaining that routine helped him cope, and when asked about insurance he mentioned it in passing, as something Claire had insisted upon, an administrative matter, nothing more. The claim was filed without urgency, processed without delay, and approved without objection, because accidental deaths trigger no immediate red flags when documentation aligns. Money moved quietly, and with it the narrative settled, until inconsistencies began to emerge not from dramatic revelations, but from ordinary administrative friction, the kind that accumulates when stories are retold. Claire's sister noticed missing notes in a shared planning file they both used, entries erased around the time of death. And while digital changes can happen for many reasons, the timing raised questions that felt uncomfortable to voice. A colleague recalled Claire mentioning stress about something she had discovered, unspecified but urgent, during a call weeks before she died, a comment that seemed irrelevant until it was not. A neighbor remembered hearing voices late the night before the death, not shouting but tense, controlled, the kind of exchange that does not carry but lingers. And though memory is unreliable, patterns form when details align. Daniel dismissed these recollections as grief-fueled misinterpretations, and initially investigators agreed. Because reopening a closed case requires more than doubt, it requires contradiction. That contradiction appeared when a routine audit at the insurance firm flagged the policy for review due to a recent beneficiary confirmation made by Daniel alone after Claire's death. An allowed action, but one that prompted a closer look at the application history. The audit revealed that the policy amount had been increased 6 months earlier, during a period when Claire had reduced her work hours and was reportedly cautious about expenses, a mismatch that demanded explanation. When contacted, Daniel said the increase was a joint decision, a precaution, and he suggested records would support that claim. Records, however, showed Claire's electronic signature absent from the amendment, replaced by a verification call logged to Daniel's number. A procedural detail that by itself proves nothing, but added weight to existing unease. Investigators requested a secondary review of the medical findings, not to accuse, but to verify, and in doing so reopened a door that had closed too easily. The fall trajectory was re-examined against the physical layout, measurements reviewed, angles recalculated, and while the conclusion remained plausible, it was no longer singular. Subtle bruising patterns once attributed to impact were reconsidered as possibly pre-existing, and the timeline narrowed in ways that complicated Daniel's account. None of this established guilt, but together it disrupted certainty, transforming an accident into a question. Daniel continued to insist on innocence, cooperated with requests, and expressed frustration at suspicion, a response that could reflect either indignation or fear. As the case shifted from closed to active review, the marriage itself became evidence, not in the sense of private moments dissected for drama, but as a structure of shared decisions, financial incentives, and trust, and the central question emerged quietly but firmly: whether a policy intended to protect a future had instead reshaped it, and whether a death ruled accidental had been understood too quickly, setting the stage for an investigation that would rely not on spectacle, but on the slow accumulation of facts that refused to stay silent. The review proceeded methodically, guided by documentation rather than rumor, establishing a baseline of verified facts while acknowledging uncertainty, a posture that preserved fairness, protected due process, and signaled that conclusions would follow evidence wherever it led, regardless of expectations or outcomes. As the case transitioned from quiet closure to formal reassessment, investigators began reconstructing the marriage not through emotional testimony, but through verifiable records, timelines, and behavioral patterns. Because when intent is hidden, consistency becomes the most reliable witness, and the Mercers' history offered both order and subtle fractures. Financial statements showed that Claire managed household budgeting meticulously, maintaining spreadsheets that tracked expenditures down to minor subscriptions, a habit that contrasted sharply with the unexplained insurance increase approved months before her death, an adjustment that would have required her awareness if past behavior held true. Email correspondence revealed Claire asking detailed questions about utility changes, tax estimates, and travel reimbursements during the same period, suggesting heightened financial vigilance rather than indifference, and this discrepancy alone did not imply wrongdoing, but it weakened Daniel's claim of mutual agreement. Phone records placed Daniel at home the night before the incident, consistent with his statement, but also showed a late evening call to the insurance provider's automated system, a call that lasted long enough to navigate menus, but ended before reaching a representative, an action Daniel later described as accidental, a misdial while clearing notifications. A plausible explanation that nevertheless added texture to the timeline. Claire's digital footprint during her final weeks indicated increased activity in shared cloud folders, including the creation of a private document labeled only with a date, the contents of which had been deleted, but whose metadata confirmed multiple revisions, an anomaly given her tendency to preserve records. Investigators could not recover the text, but they noted that deletions occurred from a device registered to Daniel after Claire's death, during a period when he said he avoided her accounts entirely, a claim that may have reflected grief or oversight but now required clarification. Interviews with friends painted a marriage outwardly functional, affectionate in public settings, supportive in conversation, yet some recalled Claire expressing unease about decisions being made without her input, framed not as fear but frustration, a sense of being sidelined in matters she once controlled. Daniel's co-workers described him as dependable, private, and methodical, traits that align equally with diligence and concealment, depending on interpretation, and investigators avoided assigning motive prematurely, focusing instead on corroboration. The staircase itself became a subject of scrutiny, not as a dramatic focal point, but as a mechanical system governed by physics, measurements taken, railing height noted, lighting conditions assessed, and prior maintenance records reviewed. There was no evidence of structural defect, no loose carpeting, no reported history of slips. And while accidents occur in safe environments, the absence of contributing factors narrowed probabilities. The medical examiner's revised review did not overturn the original conclusion but amended it, stating that while a fall remained consistent with injuries, alternative causes could not be excluded, a phrase that transformed the legal posture of the case from settled to open-ended. Toxicology results remained clean, eliminating poisoning theories but reinforcing the idea that if harm occurred, it was direct and immediate. Attention returned to timing, specifically the estimated window of death and Daniel's account of when he discovered Claire. A narrative that relied on his recollection of waking to a noise, an event difficult to verify independently. Sleep data from Daniel's fitness tracker showed a disturbance during the stated window, followed by activity consistent with movement, lending partial support to his statement, yet also documenting a period of wakefulness longer than he described before the emergency call, a discrepancy he attributed to panic and disorientation. Such gaps are common under stress, but when layered atop other inconsistencies, they gained relevance. The insurance payout timeline became increasingly central, not as proof of motive, but as a catalyst for opportunity analysis, showing that funds were disbursed rapidly and used immediately to settle the mortgage, a rational choice, followed by the transfer of remaining balances into an account Daniel had opened weeks earlier without Claire's knowledge, according to bank disclosures. Daniel said the account was intended for future planning, a claim undermined by the fact that its opening predated her death and coincided with the policy increase, a sequence that raised questions about foresight. Investigators interviewed the insurance agent who facilitated the policy change, who recalled limited interaction with Claire and more frequent contact with Daniel, including follow-up questions about claim procedures asked months before any incident, framed as general curiosity, but now suggestive of preparation. Still, curiosity is not intent, and the agent could not confirm wrongdoing. Pressure mounted quietly as investigators sought to either confirm or eliminate suspicion, mindful that false accusations destroy lives as surely as crimes do. Daniel's legal counsel advised restraint, and he declined further informal interviews, a move within his rights but one that altered the cooperative dynamic. Public awareness grew incrementally through court filings rather than headlines, preserving the case's low profile, yet within investigative circles the consensus shifted toward uncertainty. The marriage, once viewed as a backdrop, now functioned as context, revealing asymmetries in control, communication, and decision-making that did not prove violence but complicated assumptions. The policy, once a footnote, became a lens through which choices were reinterpreted, not as isolated acts but as part of a sequence that could be benign or calculated. As the review deepened, investigators prepared for the possibility that the case would hinge not on a single revelation but on cumulative inference, a challenging standard that demands patience, precision, and the willingness to accept ambiguity if proof remains insufficient. Claire's family pressed for clarity without accusation, seeking understanding rather than revenge. While Daniel maintained his innocence publicly and privately, his composure steady, his story unchanged, and in the space between these positions the investigation continued, methodically assembling a narrative that would either reaffirm accident or redefine it, knowing that whichever conclusion emerged would rest not on emotion, but on the disciplined interpretation of facts that refused to align, neatly leaving the truth suspended unresolved, and increasingly difficult to ignore. With the investigation now formally reopened, attention shifted from isolated discrepancies to pattern analysis, the method investigators rely on when individual facts refuse to declare themselves, because truth in cases like this rarely announces itself, it accumulates. Analysts map Daniel and Claire's final year together not as a narrative of love or conflict, but as a sequence of decisions, changes, and omissions, and when viewed longitudinally, subtle shifts emerged that had previously blended into normal life. Claire's workload reduction, initially attributed to burnout, coincided precisely with the policy increase and the opening of Daniel's private account, suggesting a period of transition that affected both finances and authority within the marriage. Claire's professional communications showed a woman recalibrating priorities, turning down new clients, expressing interest in stability rather than growth. Language that contrasted with the expansion of financial instruments supposedly meant to protect future ambition. Investigators obtained archived backups from Claire's work laptop, discovering fragments of deleted drafts unrelated to her job, including unsent emails addressed to Daniel that contained questions rather than accusations, inquiries about financial changes she did not recognize, and requests for transparency framed politely, almost cautiously, as if she sensed imbalance but had not yet named it. These drafts were never sent, but their existence suggested internal conflict unresolved at the time of her death. Daniel's digital history during the same period showed increased research activity around insurance claims, inheritance law, and accidental death coverage, topics he later described as general interest prompted by a coworker's experience, a plausible explanation that nevertheless gained significance when aligned with the timeline. Investigators did not interpret this as proof, but as context, because context determines plausibility. The marriage counselor the Mercers briefly consulted months earlier was interviewed, constrained by confidentiality, but able to confirm that sessions focused on communication and decision-making, not violence, with Claire expressing concern about being excluded from financial planning and Daniel expressing frustration at what he described as resistance to necessary preparation. The counselor described no imminent risk, only tension common in long-term partnerships, a characterization that neither absolved nor condemned. Forensic accountants reconstructed cash flows, identifying no sudden withdrawals or extravagant spending, but noting a gradual consolidation of assets under Daniel's control, justified on paper by efficiency, but executed without Claire's documented consent. Investigators revisited the night of the incident with renewed scrutiny, examining not emotion but logistics, the timing of lights, device activity, and routine habits. Claire's phone registered no movement after a certain hour, consistent with sleep, while Daniel's device showed intermittent activity consistent with wakefulness before the reported noise, a pattern that could reflect restlessness or anticipation, interpretation hinging on intent. Neighbors' recollections were reevaluated not for drama, but for consistency, confirming that voices were heard earlier than Daniel claimed to have gone to bed, a discrepancy he explained as misremembered time, an explanation common in traumatic events. The staircase analysis was refined using biomechanical modeling, exploring whether a fall from the reported position could generate the injury pattern observed, concluding that while possible, it would require an unusual sequence of movements, not impossible, but statistically infrequent. This did not establish homicide, but it weakened certainty. Investigators requested a second autopsy review by an independent expert, who concurred that injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, but emphasized that distinguishing between accidental fall and external force after impact was not possible post-mortem, a limitation that underscored the case's reliance on circumstantial evidence. Daniel's demeanor during this period remained controlled, cooperative through counsel, emotionally reserved, a presentation that observers interpreted differently depending on perspective, some seeing stoicism, others calculation. His public statements emphasized love, loss, and exhaustion with suspicion, framing the review as an additional burden layered onto grief, a sentiment that resonated with some and alienated others. Claire's family, while careful not to accuse, began organizing records independently, uncovering handwritten notes in a personal planner Claire kept offline, entries that referenced feeling out of the loop and needing to double-check everything, language that suggested unease without specifying fear. One entry mentioned the policy indirectly, questioning why coverage needed to increase when expenses were decreasing, a note dated weeks before her death, a detail that investigators treated with caution, recognizing that private reflections can be incomplete and emotional. Still, The note challenged the narrative of mutual agreement. Investigators interviewed the insurance firm's internal compliance team, confirming that while procedures had been followed, the policy change fell within a category that typically involved both parties, and the absence of Claire's direct confirmation was an exception rather than a norm, albeit an allowable one. This distinction mattered because it framed the change as irregular without labeling it improper. The prosecution evaluated the case's trajectory, assessing whether the accumulation of inconsistencies could meet the threshold for charges, aware that suspicion without proof risks injustice, while inaction risks impunity. They consulted behavioral analysts who cautioned against overinterpreting preparation behaviors, noting that many people research worst-case scenarios without malicious intent, and that grief can distort memory and demeanor. At the same time, they acknowledged that financial incentive combined with opportunity and unexplained inconsistencies forms the backbone of many domestic homicide cases, even when violence is absent from history. The case thus existed in a liminal state, neither closed nor charged, sustained by unanswered questions rather than definitive answers. As weeks turned into months, pressure mounted quietly, not from public outrage but from procedural necessity. Deadlines for decisions approaching, reports requiring conclusions, and families seeking resolution. Daniel's life continued under scrutiny, his routines observed, finances monitored, statements weighed, while Claire's absence became the most significant presence in the investigation, shaping every inquiry by what could no longer be asked directly. The question investigators faced was not whether something felt wrong, but whether the evidence could speak clearly enough to transform doubt into fact, a threshold that remained just out of reach, even as the pattern grew denser, more suggestive, and harder to dismiss, setting the stage for a decision that would determine whether the case advanced into court or settled into unresolved history. As deliberations intensified, prosecutors faced a familiar dilemma in complex domestic death cases: the gap between suspicion and proof, and their approach shifted from accumulation to testing, examining whether the existing evidence could withstand adversarial scrutiny or collapse under reasonable doubt. They convened a case review panel, not to decide guilt, but to stress test the narrative, isolating each inference and asking whether an alternative explanation remained viable. Financial motive was clear in structure but ambiguous in intent, because while Daniel stood to benefit significantly from the insurance policy, financial gain alone does not establish homicide, especially when the policy could plausibly be framed as prudent planning. Opportunity existed by default, given the private setting, yet opportunity without demonstrable action remains circumstantial. The inconsistencies in Daniel's statements were real but subtle, variations in timing and recollection that occur frequently in traumatic events, and while patterns of omission can indicate deception, they can also reflect shock, denial, or self-protection absent criminal intent. Prosecutors examined prior case law, noting that successful prosecutions in similar scenarios often relied on a singular, decisive element, a witness, a confession, forensic evidence that excluded accident beyond reasonable doubt, none of which were present here. The staircase analysis, though suggestive, could not conclusively disprove an accidental fall, and the medical findings, constrained by post-mortem limitations, resisted definitive interpretation. The handwritten planner note raised concerns but lacked specificity, and defense counsel would argue that private doubts do not equate to fear of harm. Digital evidence, while extensive, painted a picture of secrecy and control but stopped short of violence, and juries, prosecutors knew, are wary of convicting on character and conjecture. The panel debated whether charging Daniel would risk an acquittal that would permanently foreclose accountability, or whether declining to charge would leave an unresolved truth buried under procedural caution. Meanwhile, Daniel's legal team mounted a proactive defense strategy, retaining forensic consultants who reviewed the same evidence and reached alternative conclusions. Emphasizing statistical rarity does not equal impossibility, and that administrative irregularities in insurance processes are common and non-criminal. They prepared to argue that investigators were retrofitting meaning onto benign actions once money became visible, a cognitive bias well documented in retrospective analysis. Claire's family, informed of the review's status, expressed frustration without hostility, asking for transparency and reassurance that every avenue had been explored, a request investigators honored through detailed briefings that explained limitations as well as findings. This transparency, while ethically sound, also underscored the absence of a decisive turning point, the missing piece that would transform the case. Investigators considered leveraging civil proceedings, where standards of proof differ, but recognized that civil liability does not resolve criminal truth, and that parallel actions could complicate rather than clarify outcomes. Attention turned briefly to Daniel's behavior after the payout, scrutinizing expenditures for signs of relief or indulgence inconsistent with grief. But findings showed restraint, conservative spending, and routine financial management, behaviors defense experts would frame as evidence of normalcy rather than guilt. Psychological assessments were discussed cautiously, acknowledging that affect and demeanor are unreliable indicators and that grieving processes vary widely. Daniel's steady composure, once perceived as odd, began to read as consistent, and the absence of emotional volatility undermined theories of impulsive violence. Still, the sequence of events leading up to the death remained troubling, particularly the consolidation of control and the unanswered questions about Claire's awareness of financial changes. Prosecutors explored the possibility of fraud related to the policy modification, a narrower charge that could open avenues for discovery, but compliance reviews suggested procedural permissibility, weakening that path. The case thus hovered at an inflection point, with evidence sufficient to sustain suspicion but insufficient to compel prosecution, a precarious position that demanded restraint. Ultimately, prosecutors issued a determination declining charges at that time, citing insufficient evidence to meet the burden of proof, a decision accompanied by a formal statement acknowledging unresolved questions and the possibility of future action should new evidence emerge. The case was not closed, but it was paused, its status shifting from active prosecution to open investigation, a distinction that mattered legally and symbolically. Daniel responded with a statement expressing relief and reaffirming innocence, while emphasizing respect for the process, language carefully chosen and legally vetted. Claire's family reacted with disappointment tempered by understanding, recognizing the constraints of the system even as they struggled with uncertainty. The media coverage remained limited, reflecting the absence of dramatic resolution, and the story receded from public attention, replaced by other narratives more easily packaged. Yet within investigative archives, the case remained flagged, its files preserved with annotations highlighting unresolved anomalies, a reminder that closure in law does not always equate to truth. The insurance policy, once a mundane document, now existed as a symbol of ambiguity, representing both prudent planning and potential manipulation, depending on interpretation. As months passed, the rhythms of daily life resumed for those involved, but the case's gravity persisted in quieter forms, in unanswered questions and lingering doubt. Investigators continued to monitor developments passively, aware that time can surface what immediacy conceals, and that truth sometimes emerges not through forceful pursuit, but through the gradual erosion of secrecy. The decision not to charge was final for the moment, but not definitive, leaving the case suspended between narratives, an accident accepted by law, a possibility contested by circumstance, and a reminder that some stories resist resolution, not because justice failed, but because certainty proved unattainable within the bounds of evidence available at that time. Time altered the case in ways no procedural decision could, because while investigations pause, lives continue, and the passage of months introduced new dynamics that reshaped how earlier facts were interpreted. Daniel resumed a version of normal life, relocating to a smaller residence after selling the marital home, a move he described as practical rather than symbolic, yet one that marked a physical separation from the place where questions lingered. The sale was handled efficiently, proceeds allocated conservatively, reinforcing an image of restraint that complicated assumptions of opportunism. Claire's family maintained contact with investigators, not with demands but with updates, sharing memories that surfaced gradually as grief shifted into reflection, recollections of conversations once dismissed as mundane now re-examined for meaning. Claire's mother recalled a discussion about independence, Claire mentioning she wanted to feel fully involved again. A phrase that carried weight without clarity, and investigators logged it without interpretation, aware that memory is shaped by loss. Friends described Claire as introspective in her final months, not fearful, but more guarded, expressing a desire to understand what was changing. Language that suggested awareness of transition rather than anticipation of harm. Daniel's interactions with Claire's family grew distant, but remained civil. Communication routed increasingly through attorneys. A boundary that protected all parties, yet also reduced opportunities for informal resolution. Investigators periodically reviewed the file, each time reassessing whether new developments altered the evidentiary landscape, and each time concluding that while the narrative felt incomplete, the threshold for action remained unmet. The case became a reference point in internal discussions about the limits of circumstantial evidence, cited not as failure, but as illustration of restraint. Years passed, and with them, shifts in technology and analytic capability prompted a fresh review, a common practice in unresolved cases, driven not by suspicion alone, but by the possibility that new tools might extract meaning from old data. Digital forensics specialists revisited device backups using updated recovery methods, uncovering fragments previously inaccessible, including partial text from Claire's deleted document. Not enough to reconstruct intent, but sufficient to confirm its focus on finances and decision-making, validating earlier assumptions without advancing conclusions. The fragments contained questions rather than statements, reinforcing the image of uncertainty rather than accusation. Investigators compared these findings against Daniel's historical research patterns, noting overlap but no escalation beyond what had already been documented. Financial analysts applied newer models to assess whether the insurance increase aligned statistically with planning behaviors in similar households, finding that while uncommon, it was not anomalous, a result that diluted claims of premeditation without eliminating them. The staircase analysis was revisited with improved modeling software, again confirming that while an accidental fall was less probable under certain assumptions, it remained within the realm of possibility, especially considering human variability. These reviews did not change the case's status, but they refined its contours, reducing speculation while preserving ambiguity. Daniel, informed of the renewed review, cooperated through counsel, reiterating his willingness to engage while expressing fatigue with the process, a sentiment investigators recognized as understandable regardless of guilt. Claire's family, informed simultaneously, expressed cautious hope without expectation, understanding that technological progress does not guarantee revelation. The renewed attention prompted limited media interest, framed carefully to avoid sensationalism, emphasizing the case as an example of unresolved complexity rather than accusation, a tone that reflected investigative intent. Public response was muted, characterized by discussion rather than outrage, and the story circulated briefly before receding again. Within investigative circles, the case spurred training discussions about cognitive bias, particularly the tendency to infer intent from outcome, and the importance of distinguishing correlation from causation. The insurance policy, though central to narrative framing, was reframed internally as a contextual factor rather than a driver, its significance contingent on interpretation rather than inherent meaning. Investigators acknowledged that financial instruments often become symbols in domestic cases because they provide tangible reference points in the absence of witnesses. But symbolism must not substitute for proof. As the years accumulated, the likelihood of new evidence diminished, not because the truth had settled, but because opportunities for discovery narrowed, memories faded, and data degraded. The case transitioned formally into a cold review status, maintained in archives with periodic audits but no active pursuit, a classification that reflects realism rather than resignation. Daniel aged under the shadow of unresolved suspicion in some circles and complete exoneration in others, a duality that shaped his social interactions and choices. While Claire's absence remained definitive, her life reduced in records to dates, transactions, and unanswered questions. The system, designed to resolve, sometimes preserves, and this case exemplified that function, holding space for uncertainty rather than forcing closure. Investigators recognized that some truths remain probabilistic rather than provable, and that justice systems, bound by standards, must sometimes accept ambiguity to avoid error. The decision not to charge endured not as vindication or failure, but as an acknowledgement of limits, a recognition that evidence must speak louder than suspicion. As the file aged, annotations emphasized lessons learned, the importance of early scrutiny in domestic deaths involving financial change, the need for balanced skepticism, and the ethical imperative to protect both the deceased's dignity and the living's rights. The story of the marriage, the policy, and the death thus settled into a quiet permanence, neither resolved nor forgotten, existing as a reminder that not all cases yield answers, and that restraint, though unsatisfying, is sometimes the most responsible conclusion available when certainty remains just beyond reach. The passage of time did not close the questions surrounding Claire Mercer's death, but it changed the way those questions were held, shifting them from urgent demands into persistent undercurrents that influence decisions quietly rather than decisively. Investigators who inherited the file years later approached it without the emotional residue of its early days, reading reports as artifacts rather than events, which allowed patterns to surface with a different clarity. They noted how often domestic cases hinge on narratives formed in the first 48 hours, and how those narratives, once accepted, shape every subsequent interpretation, a dynamic evident here in the early classification of accident. Training materials increasingly reference cases like this one, emphasizing the need for early financial scrutiny when large policies exist, not because money proves motive, but because money alters incentives, and incentives alter behavior in ways that may precede harm. Claire's case was cited anonymously as an example of how procedural completeness can coexist with unresolved doubt, a distinction important for institutional learning. Daniel continued to live under that dual legacy, officially cleared yet unofficially questioned, a status that affected employment opportunities, social relationships, and personal choices, consequences that exist outside legal determinations. He avoided publicity, declined interviews, and structured his life conservatively, actions that could be interpreted as avoidance or as self-preservation, interpretation again dependent on assumption. Claire's family commemorated her privately, establishing a scholarship in her name focused on financial literacy, a choice that reflected both her professional identity and the unresolved questions surrounding control and transparency, an act of meaning-making rather than accusation. They did not campaign publicly for prosecution, a restraint that stemmed from exhaustion rather than acceptance, and their silence was often misread as closure. Investigators occasionally revisited the case when related patterns emerged elsewhere, comparing notes across jurisdictions, exploring whether similarities in policy timing, domestic dynamics, and accidental rulings suggested systemic blind spots. These comparisons yielded insights but no actionable leads, reinforcing the conclusion that while the case was instructive, it was not necessarily solvable. Advances in behavioral analysis prompted renewed discussion about Daniel's research history and financial consolidation, but experts cautioned against retrospective certainty, emphasizing that many individuals engage in contingency planning without malicious intent, particularly when influenced by anxiety or external examples. This caution shaped institutional culture, tempering zeal with humility. The legal record remained unchanged, the death certificate still listing accident, the policy still lawfully paid, the absence of charges still definitive. Yet the narrative lived differently in informal discourse, where certainty is less constrained. Online forums occasionally resurrected the case when fragments surfaced through public records, speculation filling gaps left by evidence, a phenomenon investigators monitored without engagement, aware that speculation neither proves nor disproves, but can harm indiscriminately. Daniel's counsel periodically issued reminders that no charges had ever been filed, statements accurate yet insufficient to quell curiosity, illustrating the gap between legal truth and social perception. The case influenced policy discussions within insurance firms as well, prompting revisions that required more robust dual confirmation for significant changes, a preventive measure that acknowledged risk without assigning blame. In this way, the case produced impact without resolution, altering procedures and awareness rather than outcomes. Investigators reflected privately on whether earlier intervention might have clarified matters, a question unanswerable but instructive, reinforcing the importance of skepticism balanced with fairness. Claire's final months remained a focal point of contemplation, her unsent questions and planner notes emblematic of uncertainty rather than fear, suggesting a woman sensing imbalance but not anticipating violence, a nuance that complicated simplistic narratives. Daniel's version of events never changed materially, a consistency that both supported innocence and invited suspicion, depending on one's framework, because consistency can reflect truth or rehearsal. The system, bound to evidence, ultimately privileged consistency absent contradiction. Years later, when a similar case elsewhere resulted in prosecution due to a single decisive piece of evidence, investigators revisited Claire's file briefly, searching for parallels and finding none that crossed the evidentiary threshold. This reinforced the uncomfortable reality that outcomes often hinge on chance discoveries rather than moral clarity. Claire's death thus remained categorized as an accident, not because investigators were convinced beyond doubt, but because doubt could not be resolved in the opposite direction, a distinction critical to justice yet unsatisfying to narrative. The marriage, viewed in retrospect, appeared neither idyllic nor overtly dangerous, but ordinary, marked by shifting power dynamics and unspoken tension common to many relationships, a banality that made the unresolved nature of the death more unsettling. The insurance policy, initially mundane, evolved into a symbol of that tension, representing security, secrecy, and consequence simultaneously, depending on perspective. As institutional memory of the case faded, replaced by newer files, its lessons persisted quietly in checklists, training modules, and procedural safeguards, influencing how future cases would be approached. Daniel aged further, his life shaped by an event that defined him in ways he could neither escape nor fully explain. While Claire's legacy existed in absence, her story incomplete by design rather than neglect. The case demonstrated that justice systems are designed not to deliver emotional satisfaction, but to prevent error, and that this restraint, though often criticized, protects against outcomes worse than ambiguity. In accepting that, investigators acknowledge the limits of their role, recognizing that some truths remain personal rather than provable, and that the responsibility of the system is not to resolve every doubt, but to act only when doubt has been replaced by evidence strong enough to justify irreversible action. A standard not met here, leaving the story suspended, defined as much by what could not be shown as by what was known. Years after the formal review had settled into institutional memory, the case resurfaced not through discovery, but through comparison, as analysts revisited past files to reassess how domestic deaths with financial entanglements had been evaluated over time. Claire Mercer's file was one of several selected for this retrospective exercise, not because of unresolved suspicion alone, but because it embodied the tension between plausibility and proof. Analysts examined how language used in early reports framed the trajectory of the case, noting that the word accidental appeared quickly and often, shaping expectations before deeper analysis occurred. This linguistic framing mattered, because once an explanation gains administrative momentum, alternative interpretations face higher barriers. The review highlighted how early acceptance of an accident influenced subsequent decisions, from the speed of insurance processing to the scope of forensic inquiry, creating a cascade effect that narrowed investigative options. This was not identified as negligence, but as a structural tendency within systems designed for efficiency. The analysts also revisited the insurance timeline, focusing less on motive and more on procedural interaction, observing how Daniel's engagement with the policy process demonstrated familiarity that exceeded what many beneficiaries exhibit, a detail that remained ambiguous but noteworthy. They compared this to similar cases where beneficiaries showed comparable familiarity without criminal implication, reinforcing the difficulty of inference. Claire's planner notes were reassessed in this context, interpreted as indicators of autonomy, concern rather than fear, aligning with broader patterns of relationship negotiation rather than imminent danger. This reframing neither exonerated nor implicated, but contextualized. The analysts concluded that the case illustrated how modern domestic relationships, characterized by shared yet uneven control over finances and information, complicate traditional models of motive. Financial consolidation, once viewed as a clear red flag, appeared increasingly common in households navigating uncertainty, economic pressure, or differing risk tolerance. This insight did not diminish the relevance of financial scrutiny, but it underscored the need for nuanced interpretation. The review also addressed the role of technology, acknowledging that while digital footprints offer unprecedented access to behavior, they also generate noise, patterns that appear meaningful only in hindsight. Claire's unsent drafts and deleted files exemplified this challenge, fragments of thought preserved without context, inviting interpretation while resisting certainty. Daniel's consistent narrative was re-examined through updated deception detection frameworks, which cautioned against over-reliance on behavioral cues absent corroboration. The frameworks emphasized that consistency can stem from truth, rehearsal, or cognitive fixation, and without external validation, its probative value remains limited. The analysts noted that the absence of escalation over time, no emerging evidence, no contradictory witness statements, no financial anomalies beyond those already documented, reduced the likelihood of future resolution. They recommended the case remain archived with periodic review, but acknowledged that its evidentiary ceiling had likely been reached. This conclusion was shared internally as part of a broader initiative to refine investigative thresholds, ensuring resources were allocated where probability justified pursuit. Daniel was not informed of this specific review, as it did not alter his legal status, and Claire's family received only a general update affirming that no new evidence had emerged. Their response was measured, reflecting years of acclimation to uncertainty. The family's focus had shifted toward preservation of Claire's memory rather than pursuit of answers, an evolution shaped by time rather than satisfaction. They continued to honor her life through personal rituals and public contributions, choices that reclaimed agency in the absence of resolution. Daniel's life trajectory remained modest, marked by stability rather than expansion, a pattern that some interpreted as evidence of innocence and others as the long shadow of suspicion. He avoided forming new long-term relationships, according to acquaintances, a choice attributed variously to grief, caution, or self-imposed isolation, none of which could be verified. The case occasionally appeared in academic discussions about circumstantial evidence, cited as an example of how systems balance skepticism with restraint. Students debated whether the outcome represented failure or fidelity to principle, a debate without definitive answer. The insurance industry's procedural changes persisted, a quiet legacy of the case that reduced the likelihood of similar ambiguities in the future. Investigators reflected on how prevention often emerges from unresolved cases, shaping safeguards that operate silently. Claire's death thus contributed indirectly to broader protection, an outcome that did not answer personal questions but served a collective function. The marriage itself, when stripped of narrative overlay, appeared as many do in retrospect, a series of compromises, miscommunications, and unspoken concerns that rarely announced their significance until examined after loss. The absence of overt conflict challenged simplistic assumptions about violence, reminding investigators that harm does not always emerge from visible hostility. The case reinforced the principle that systems must resist the urge to retrofit meaning onto tragedy, even when coincidence aligns with suspicion. As the years advanced, institutional distance increased, and the file's annotations shifted from active inquiry to historical reference. Its status unchanged, but its role transformed. It became less a candidate for resolution and more a lesson in limitation, illustrating how justice operates within boundaries that prioritize evidence over intuition. In that sense, the case achieved a form of closure not through answers, but through acceptance of ambiguity as an ethical stance. Claire Mercer's story remained unfinished, defined by what could be shown rather than what might be believed, and Daniel Mercer's life continued under that same condition, both bound by a moment that resisted classification beyond the narrow confines of law, leaving the truth suspended between narratives, unresolved but not abandoned. As the case aged further, it entered a phase rarely discussed outside investigative circles, the period when unresolved files become mirrors rather than mysteries, reflecting the assumptions, limits, and priorities of the systems that handled them. Claire Mercer's file was now more than a record of a death. It was an artifact of process, illustrating how decisions made under uncertainty ripple forward indefinitely. New investigators encountering the case for the first time often reacted similarly, noting the same tension between the ordinary and the unsettling. The absence of violence contrasted with the presence of incentive, and the way documentation both illuminated and obscured. Training supervisors used the case to demonstrate how early administrative closure can shape later perception, emphasizing that classifications such as accidental are not conclusions but starting points, provisional labels that must remain open to challenge. This pedagogical framing shifted how the case was discussed internally, no longer as a potential miscarriage of justice, but as a case study in cautious restraint. Analysts revisited the early insurance payout, focusing on institutional trust, noting how systems assume good faith unless contradicted, and how that assumption, while necessary for efficiency, can also limit retrospective scrutiny. The firm's revised policies, implemented quietly after internal review, required more rigorous confirmation protocols, changes that reduced ambiguity for future claims but offered no retroactive clarity. Claire's family observed these developments from a distance, aware that institutional learning did not equate to personal answers, yet recognizing that her case had contributed to change in ways not immediately visible. They described a gradual shift in their own perspective, from seeking explanation to accepting uncertainty as a permanent condition, a process that unfolded unevenly across family members. Some continued to privately suspect wrongdoing, others leaned toward acceptance of accident, and many held both views simultaneously, an emotional complexity that mirrored the case itself. Daniel, for his part, remained a static figure in the narrative, his story unchanged, his legal status settled, yet his identity permanently linked to a question mark he could neither erase nor resolve. He continued to comply with occasional procedural inquiries, responding through counsel when archival reviews prompted contact, a formality that reinforced the case's unresolved status without advancing it. Socially, he became increasingly private, a pattern that observers interpreted through competing lenses, either as a natural response to prolonged scrutiny or as evidence of something to hide, illustrating how perception persists independent of proof. The case occasionally resurfaced in professional conferences addressing domestic death investigations, where experts debated the balance between vigilance and overreach, using anonymized elements of Claire's story to explore ethical thresholds. These discussions emphasized the danger of confirmation bias, the tendency to reinterpret neutral facts once a narrative takes hold, a risk evident in how the insurance policy had come to dominate interpretation. Participants acknowledged that while financial motive is a powerful heuristic, it must be grounded in demonstrable action, not inferred desire. The absence of escalation in Daniel's behavior after the payout, no conspicuous spending, no abrupt life changes, continued to complicate motive-based theories, reinforcing the ambiguity. Advances in data analytics prompted another limited review, focusing on behavioral baselines rather than anomalies, comparing Daniel's actions against large datasets of bereaved spouses, revealing that his patterns, while reserved, fell within normative ranges. This statistical framing further eroded arguments based on demeanor, underscoring the unreliability of behavioral inference. Investigators also examined how Claire's autonomy concerns fit broader relational dynamics, recognizing that many individuals experience shifts in control without anticipating harm, a reality that challenges narratives equating secrecy with danger. The marriage, viewed through this lens, appeared strained but not exceptional, its tensions reflective of broader social patterns rather than unique pathology. The case's endurance thus lay not in unresolved suspicion alone, but in its resistance to categorization, defying binary conclusions. For investigators, this resistance became instructive, reinforcing the principle that not all uncertainty warrants resolution through prosecution, and that the cost of error must be weighed alongside the desire for closure. Claire's death certificate remained unchanged, a document that satisfied administrative requirements while leaving existential questions unanswered. Her memory persisted in quieter forms, stories shared among those who knew her, professional contributions remembered by colleagues, personal traits recalled by family, all independent of the circumstances of her death. Daniel's life continued under a similar duality, legally unburdened yet socially marked, a condition that illustrates how legal outcomes do not fully determine lived experience. The case demonstrated how justice systems prioritize prevention of wrongful conviction over satisfaction of doubt, a priority that can feel unsatisfying yet essential. As time advanced, the likelihood of new evidence diminished further, not because truth had been concealed successfully, but because the window for discovery had closed naturally, a reality investigators accept with reluctance. The file's annotations increasingly emphasized procedural lessons rather than investigative leads, signaling a shift from pursuit to preservation. In this stage, the case no longer asked who was responsible, but how responsibility is assessed, a meta-question that reframed its significance. Claire Mercer's story thus evolved from a specific inquiry into a broader reflection on how systems handle ambiguity, how families live with unresolved loss, and how individuals navigate suspicion without adjudication. The marriage, the policy, and the death remained intertwined in record and memory, not as evidence of certainty, but as an enduring example of how ordinary decisions can acquire extraordinary weight when examined through the lens of tragedy. The case settled into its final form, not closed, not solved, but contextualized, its meaning shaped as much by institutional response as by the events themselves, leaving a legacy defined less by answers than by the disciplined acceptance of what could not be conclusively proven. In its later years, the case assumed a quieter role, no longer an active investigation, but a reference point that shaped how similar situations were approached, a subtle influence rather than a headline. New protocols adopted across agencies reflected lessons drawn indirectly from cases like Claire Mercer's, emphasizing earlier multidisciplinary review when domestic deaths intersected with significant financial changes, not to presume guilt, but to preserve analytical flexibility before narratives hardened. Investigators who reviewed the Mercer file during this period noted how easily routine explanations can satisfy institutional needs while leaving emotional and moral questions unresolved, a tension inherent in systems designed to prioritize proof over probability. The case underscored how legal truth differs from personal truth, and how the former, by necessity, must remain narrower. Claire's family, now years removed from the immediacy of loss, described a complex relationship with the unanswered questions, acknowledging that certainty might never come and that continued pursuit risked consuming the memory of Claire herself. They chose instead to focus on who she had been rather than how she died, a reframing that offered a form of peace without resolution. This choice did not eliminate doubt, but it reduced its dominance, allowing grief to coexist with acceptance rather than conflict. Daniel, aging into middle life, carried the case as a permanent qualifier to his identity, an invisible annotation that surfaced unpredictably in professional background checks, social interactions, and private reflection. He remained consistent in his account, consistent in his lifestyle, and consistent in his refusal to engage publicly, a pattern that over time became less remarkable, blending into the background of ordinary existence. Some acquaintances came to see the prolonged suspicion as unjust, arguing that absence of proof should close debate, while others maintained quiet skepticism, illustrating how social judgment operates independently of legal standards. The case occasionally reappeared in anonymized academic literature discussing evidentiary thresholds, cited not as a failure, but as an illustration of principled restraint, reinforcing the idea that justice systems must tolerate uncertainty to avoid irreversible error. These discussions often highlighted how domestic dynamics, particularly around finances and control, can create interpretive traps, where normal variations are retroactively imbued with sinister meaning. Claire's planner notes, once central to suspicion, were reframed as common expressions of autonomy concern, experiences shared by many without leading to harm, a reframing that reduced their probative weight while preserving their emotional significance. Technological advances continued, but each promised breakthrough fell short of revelation, confirming rather than transforming existing interpretations. Digital reconstructions offered clearer timelines but no new actions. Financial models refined probabilities but not conclusions, and behavioral analytics reinforced the variability of human response under stress. The case thus reached a plateau, where additional analysis yielded diminishing returns, a reality acknowledged openly within investigative reviews. The file remained intact, accessible, and periodically audited, not because resolution was expected, but because unresolved cases require stewardship as much as pursuit. This stewardship reflected an ethical commitment to possibility without presumption, a balance difficult to maintain yet essential. Claire's story persisted in institutional memory as a reminder that not all harm announces itself clearly, and that systems must resist both complacency and overreach. For investigators, the case reinforced humility, the recognition that evidence defines action, not intuition, and that restraint is sometimes the most responsible choice. For families, it illustrated the limits of external validation, the necessity of internal reconciliation when answers remain elusive. For Daniel, it represented a life shaped by an event that could not be fully explained or escaped, a burden borne quietly rather than publicly. The marriage, when revisited through this long lens, appeared as a human relationship marked by misalignment rather than malice, its end tragic regardless of cause. The insurance policy, stripped of symbolic weight, returned to its functional identity as a financial instrument, its significance contextual rather than determinative. Yet the convergence of these elements in time ensured that the story would remain compelling precisely because it resisted conclusion. The case demonstrated that justice systems operate within constraints that do not always align with emotional needs, and that the absence of charges does not equate to the absence of questions. It also showed that certainty is not the default state of truth, but a threshold reached only when evidence compels it. In this sense, the Mercer case became less about assigning responsibility and more about understanding process, about how decisions are made, reviewed, and sometimes left open. Its endurance lay in its ordinariness, the lack of dramatic revelation making it more unsettling rather than less, because it mirrored the complexity of real life rather than the clarity of fiction. As years continued to pass, the likelihood of new evidence receded further, not as a failure of diligence, but as a function of time's erosion. The case remained where it had settled, between narratives, defined by documentation rather than declarations, and remembered not for what it proved, but for what it illustrated about the careful boundaries of judgment. In that space, the story continued to exist, not as an accusation or an exoneration, but as an unresolved record, a testament to the reality that some truths remain beyond reach, not because they are hidden deliberately, but because the evidence necessary to confirm them never fully materializes, leaving behind only the disciplined silence of an open file and the enduring impact of a life lost without definitive explanation. In the final accounting, the case of Claire Mercer did not conclude with revelation, confession, or adjudication, but with endurance, a sustained presence within records, memories, and institutional practice that outlasted the urgency of investigation. The marriage, once a private arrangement between two people, became a documented structure examined through financial statements, digital traces, and professional assessments, each offering partial insight without total clarity. The life insurance policy, ordinary in conception, acquired disproportionate weight because it intersected with loss, timing, and control, illustrating how neutral instruments can become charged when context shifts. The death, ruled accidental and never legally reclassified, remained both administratively settled and narratively unsettled, a duality that defined the case's legacy. Investigators who encountered the file in its later years described it as complete yet incomplete, exhaustive in scope yet lacking the decisive element that transforms doubt into certainty. This tension shaped how the case was remembered internally, not as a mistake, but as a demonstration of restraint exercised under pressure. The absence of charges did not signify indifference, but adherence to standards designed to protect against irreversible error, a principle that governs justice systems even when outcomes feel unsatisfying. Claire's family carried forward with lives shaped by unanswered questions, finding meaning not in resolution but in remembrance, honoring her through acts that reflected her values rather than the circumstances of her death. They learned to live alongside ambiguity, an accommodation forged gradually, unevenly, and without consensus, yet sustained by shared respect for truth over accusation. Daniel continued his life under the weight of association, neither condemned nor vindicated in the court of public imagination, a position that illustrated how legal outcomes do not fully define social reality. His consistency over time became less scrutinized and more normalized, the extraordinary becoming ordinary through repetition, a process that did not erase suspicion but softened its immediacy. The system moved on, as systems must, allocating resources to cases where evidence demanded action, while maintaining stewardship over unresolved files as a matter of principle. Claire's case remained accessible, reviewed periodically, and preserved with care, reflecting an understanding that justice includes preservation even when pursuit has ended. The lessons drawn from the case persisted quietly, influencing training, policy, and awareness, shaping how future investigations approached similar intersections of domestic dynamics and financial change. These impacts, though indirect, represented a form of outcome distinct from conviction or acquittal, one measured in prevention and procedural refinement rather than verdicts. The story endured because it resisted narrative closure, mirroring the complexity of real life rather than the neatness of fiction. It challenged assumptions about motive, intent, and proof, reminding those who examined it that coincidence and causation can align without converging, and that probability does not equal guilt. The marriage, when viewed without the lens of suspicion, appeared human and imperfect, shaped by shifting roles and unspoken tensions common to many relationships, a banality that underscored the tragedy regardless of cause. The policy, once symbolic, receded into context, its importance acknowledged without exaggeration. The death remained a fact without a definitive explanation, a reality that demanded acceptance rather than resolution. Over time, the case became less about determining what happened and more about understanding how systems respond when certainty is unattainable. It illustrated the ethical necessity of restraint, the discipline required to say not proven rather than assumed, and the humility inherent in acknowledging limits. For those who studied it, the case reinforced that justice is not synonymous with certainty, and that the pursuit of truth must be balanced against the protection of rights. Claire Mercer's story remained unfinished in the way many real stories are, defined by documentation rather than declaration, remembered through impact rather than conclusion. It existed as a quiet testament to the fact that some answers remain inaccessible, not through failure of effort, but through absence of evidence. The open file stood as both a safeguard and a reminder, preserving the possibility of future understanding while accepting present limitation. In that space between suspicion and proof, the case found its final form, not resolved, not forgotten, but held, a record of a marriage, a policy, and a death that together revealed less about guilt than about the careful boundaries within which judgment must operate. Boundaries that protect the living even as they leave questions about the dead unanswered, and in doing so, define the uneasy but necessary balance at the heart of justice.